On July 23, 1892, a 23-year-old anarchist walked into Henry Clay Frick's Pittsburgh office, pulled a revolver, and shot him 3 times in the neck. Frick wrestled the gun away. The anarchist pulled a sharpened file and stabbed him 7 times. Frick still refused to leave his desk. He finished his meeting with blood pooling beneath his chair, then walked himself to surgery and survived. But the man who could survive assassination could not survive history. When he died 27 years later, the New York Times declared his name abhorrent to organized labor. He had built the last great mansion on Fifth Avenue, filled it with billions in art, and left it all to the public in the largest cultural bequest America had ever seen. And yet, the gift could not erase what he had done to earn it. Chapter 1: The Boy Who Learned to Calculate Everything. Henry Clay Frick was 14 years old when he realized that sentiment was a luxury for people who could afford to feel. It was 1863. The Civil War raged. His younger sister Maria had just died from fever. The family farm in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, produced enough to eat, but never enough to escape. His mother wept, his father worked, and young Henry sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and paper, calculating. He was not calculating grief, he was calculating coal. The hills around his family's farm sat on top of the Connellsville Coal Basin, one of the richest deposits in America. Every ton that came out of the ground could be baked into coke, the purified fuel that fed steel furnaces. He had watched men extract it, transport it, sell it. He had studied the numbers in newspapers, and he understood something that separated him from every other ambitious boy in Western Pennsylvania. Fortunes were not built on labor. They were built on controlling what labor needed. His grandfather, Abraham Overholt, had proven it. Overholt owned the largest whiskey distillery in the state. He had money, land, respect. Young Henry could see the fortune from his bedroom window, a brick compound where grain became liquor and liquor became wealth. But he could never touch it. His father had married into the family but owned nothing. The lesson was clear. Proximity to wealth meant nothing. Control meant everything. So Frick studied. Not literature or philosophy or the things that made men cultured. He studied geology, accounting, supply chains. By age 16, he could assess a coal seam's quality by looking at exposed rock. By 17, he was keeping books for his grandfather's distillery. By 19, he knew the location, ownership, and production capacity of every coke operation within 50 miles. Other boys his age dreamed of adventure. Frick dreamed of monopoly. He enrolled at Otterbein College in Ohio, but left after 1 semester. Formal education taught him nothing. He could not learn faster from ledgers and land surveys. He returned home and took a job as a clerk, $3 per week. He saved every penny, spent nothing on pleasure, lived with his parents, waited. He was waiting for the moment when knowledge became leverage. By 1870, at age 21, he had saved enough to make his first move. Not enough to buy coal lands outright, but enough to convince others he was worth betting on. He borrowed from family, from local investors, from anyone who would listen to a young man with a sharp pencil and sharper vision. He did not ask for money to mine coal. He asked for money to build coke ovens. The difference was everything. Coal miners were common, coke producers were rare, and Frick had identified a coming crisis. The steel industry was exploding. Every new furnace needed coke. But coke production had not kept pace with demand. The gap was widening. and gaps were where fortunes lived. Within 2 years, Frick owned 600 acres of coal land and 50 coke ovens. He was 23 years old. He worked 18-hour days. He slept in a boarding house. He wore the same suit until it frayed. Every dollar went back into land, into ovens, and into the systematic acquisition of supply. And then he met Andrew Carnegie. The partnership that would define both their lives began with a simple transaction. Carnegie needed coke. Frick had coke. They signed a contract, but Frick saw past the immediate sale. He saw that Carnegie's steel empire would only grow larger, would only need more fuel, would only become more dependent on whoever controlled the ovens. So Frick kept building. By 1880, he owned 6,000 acres of coal land and 40 coke ovens. His company, H.C. Frick Coke Company, produced more coke than any other operation in America. He was 29 years old, and Carnegie was no longer his customer. Carnegie was his partner. Chapter 2: The Man Who Bought Winter. At 21, Frick borrowed everything he could and bet it all on a single idea: freeze your competitors out. The coke business ran on a predictable cycle. In summer, demand surged. Steel furnaces burned hot, production peaked, and coke prices climbed. In winter, demand collapsed. Furnaces banked their fires, orders vanished. Small coke producers shut down their ovens to save on labor costs and raw materials. They waited for spring. Frick did not wait. He ran his ovens through winter. It made no financial sense on paper. Operating costs exceeded revenue. Coal had to be mined. Ovens had to be fed. Workers had to be paid. All to produce coke that nobody wanted to buy. His competitors thought he was reckless. His investors thought he was insane. But Frick was neither. He was systematic. Winter production served two purposes. First, it kept his workforce intact. Skilled coke workers were hard to find and harder to train. If he laid them off each winter, they would find other work. He would have to rebuild his labor force every spring. Continuous operation meant continuous expertise. Second, and more important, it bankrupted competitors. Small producers could not afford to operate at a loss. When they shut down for winter, they saved money but lost market position. When spring arrived and demand returned, they scrambled to restart ovens, rehire workers, and fulfill orders. The delay cost them customers. And those customers turned to the one producer who had never stopped: Frick. By 1881, his strategy had worked. Half the small coke operations in western Pennsylvania had sold out or gone under. Frick bought their land at bankruptcy prices, and he acquired their ovens, their coal rights, their infrastructure. What began as a risky bet became vertical integration. He did not just produce coke. He controlled the land beneath it, the ovens that baked it, and the rail lines that shipped it. And Carnegie noticed. In December 1881, Carnegie offered Frick a partnership, not a supply contract, a merger. Carnegie would buy a controlling interest in H.C. Frick Coke Company. Frick would manage the operation and receive a share of Carnegie Steel's profits. It was the kind of offer that made men rich. Frick negotiated terms that made him richer. He insisted on retaining operational control of the coke works. Carnegie could own the majority stake, but Frick would run the day-to-day business with zero interference. He demanded a seat on the board of Carnegie Steel, and he required that his shares be valued not at book price, but at market price, ensuring that future growth benefited him directly. Carnegie agreed to everything. He needed Frick more than Frick needed him. On January 1st, 1882, the deal closed. Frick became chairman of H.C. Frick Coke Company and a partner in Carnegie Steel. He was 31 years old. He controlled the fuel that powered the largest steel operation in America. And he had done it without sentiment, without hesitation, without ever believing that success required kindness. The same year, he married Adelaide Childs. Adelaide was 23, the daughter of a successful Pittsburgh shoe manufacturer. She was educated, cultured, interested in art and music, and the things Frick had never made time for. The courtship was brief, the wedding was private, and the marriage became something unexpected, a partnership of genuine affection. Frick had built his fortune by treating every relationship as transactional. But Adelaide was different. She did not soften him. She did not make him kind. But she gave him something he had not realized he wanted, a vision of what wealth could build beyond ledgers and ovens. She introduced him to art galleries, to opera, to the idea that beauty was not frivolous, but foundational, that a life spent accumulating money without creating meaning was a life wasted. Frick listened, not because he agreed, but because he saw utility in what she offered. Beauty could be permanent, steel rusted, coal seams emptied, but a painting could outlast the man who bought it. For the first time, Frick began to think past the next acquisition. He began to imagine legacy, but first he had to consolidate power. By 1889, Carnegie made him chairman of Carnegie Steel. Frick now controlled both the fuel and the furnaces. 35,000 workers answered to him. Production quotas, wage rates, labor contracts, all of it flowed through his office. And Frick managed it the way he managed everything, with total control and zero tolerance for inefficiency. He believed that workers were a cost to be minimized, not partners to be negotiated with. When unions demanded higher wages, he saw extortion. When they threatened strikes, he saw weakness. He had built his empire by calculating every variable, controlling every input, eliminating every competitor. Labor would be no different. Chapter 3. The office where nothing was left to chance. Inside Frick's Pittsburgh headquarters, every wall was lined with maps showing every coal seam, every competitor's weakness, every route to monopoly. The office occupied the top floor of a granite building on Fifth Avenue in downtown Pittsburgh. Tall windows overlooked the Monongahela River and the smokestacks of Homestead Steelworks, Carnegie's prize facility. Frick's desk sat in the center of the room, positioned so he could see anyone who entered. No clutter, no sentiment, just ledgers, maps, and correspondence filed with military precision. He arrived each morning at 6, left after dark, ate lunch at his desk, took no vacations. His routine never varied. Review production reports, assess market conditions, issue orders. The work was not dramatic. It was methodical. And that was the point. Frick did not believe in inspiration or instinct. He believed in information. The maps on his walls showed every coal deposit in western Pennsylvania, color-coded by quality, ownership, and accessibility. Red pins marked his properties. Blue pins marked competitors. Black pins marked available land. Every quarter, he updated the maps. Every decision began with them. He knew which mines produced the best coking coal. He knew which rail lines charged the lowest freight rates. He knew which suppliers could be pressured and which could be bought. He eliminated guesswork. And in eliminating guesswork, he eliminated risk. His management philosophy extended to labor. Workers were a variable in the production equation. Their wages, hours, and safety conditions were inputs that affected output. Frick calculated the minimum cost required to keep furnaces running and set wages accordingly. When unions demanded more, He saw it as workers attempting to renegotiate a contract they had already accepted by showing up. He did not see this as cruelty. He saw it as honesty. Other industrialists pretended paternalism. They built company towns, threw Christmas parties, spoke of workers as family. Frick refused the charade. He paid what the market required and expected performance in return. If workers were unsatisfied, they could leave. If they could not leave, the market had spoken. This clarity made him effective. It also made him hated. By 1890, Carnegie Steel produced more steel than all of Great Britain. The Homestead Works alone employed 3,800 men and operated 24 hours a day. The facility sprawled across 500 acres along the river, a maze of blast furnaces, rolling mills, and rail sidings. It was the largest integrated steel plant in the world, and its workers were organizing. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers represented the skilled laborers at Homestead. They negotiated wage scales, work rules, and safety conditions. The contract was set to expire in June 1892. The union wanted higher pay. Frick wanted lower costs. Neither side would bend. Frick saw the confrontation as inevitable. Unions sought to control what workers were paid. He sought to control what production cost. The two aims were incompatible. One would win, one would lose. Sentiment would not change the math. So he prepared for war. In January 1892, 6 months before the contract expired, Frick began fortifying Homestead. He ordered construction of a 3-mile fence around the entire plant, 12 feet high, topped with barbed wire, watchtowers at intervals, searchlights that swept the grounds after dark. Workers called it Fort Frick. He installed sniper platforms on the roofs of key buildings. He stockpiled rifles and ammunition in the plant armory. He arranged for 300 Pinkerton guards to be on standby, ready to deploy the moment the strike began. He coordinated with the Pennsylvania governor to have state militia available if needed. And he issued a public statement. Carnegie Steel would no longer recognize the union. When the contract expired, the company would negotiate with individual workers only. Anyone who refused those terms would be replaced. It was not a negotiation tactic. It was a declaration. At home, Adelaide watched her husband prepare for battle with the same precision he brought to every other calculation. She did not argue. She did not plead for compromise. She understood who she had married, but she also understood the cost. Their daughter Martha had died 2 years earlier, in 1890. She was 6 years old. Frick had grieved the way he did everything else, privately, efficiently, without allowing emotion to disrupt his work. Adelaide had no such detachment. The loss broke something in her, and watching her husband march toward another conflict, one he could avoid but refused to, deepened the wound. She stayed silent, but her silence carried weight. Frick felt it. He always felt her disapproval, even when unspoken, but he did not change course. He believed he was right, not morally right, strategically right. In unions represented chaos. He represented order. The outcome was predetermined. All that remained was execution. On June 24, 1892, the contract expired. 3,000 workers walked out. Frick locked the gates. The Homestead strike had begun, and with it, the transformation of Henry Clay Frick from ruthless industrialist into the most hated man in America. Chapter 4. The strike that revealed everything. When 3,000 workers walked out of Homestead in June 1892, Frick did not negotiate. He fortified. The strike began peacefully, Workers picketed outside the gates. They carried signs demanding fair wages and union recognition. They believed that public pressure would force Carnegie Steel to compromise. They believed wrong. Frick had no intention of compromising, and he had spent 6 months preparing for exactly this scenario. The fence was built, the guards were hired, the replacement workers were recruited. All that remained was timing. On July 5th, he made his move. At 2 in the morning, 300 Pinkerton guards boarded 2 barges at a dock 30 miles downriver. The barges were towed by tugboat, moving silently through the darkness toward Homestead. The plan was simple: land the guards at the plant's river entrance, secure the facility, allow replacement workers to enter under armed protection, break the strike by dawn. The workers were waiting. Picketers had been watching the river for days. They knew Frick would try to bring in guards. When the barges appeared at 4 in the morning, a warning bell rang through the town. 3,000 men grabbed rifles, pistols, clubs, and anything else they could carry. They flooded the riverbank. The barges attempted to dock. Workers opened fire. The Pinkerton guards fired back. For 12 hours, the 2 sides exchanged gunfire across 50 yards of open water. Workers rolled a flatbed rail car loaded with burning oil toward the dock, trying to set the barges ablaze. Pinkerton shot anyone who approached. Someone threw dynamite. The explosion rocked the river but missed its target. By noon, the barges were riddled with bullet holes. 3 Pinkerton guards lay dead. 7 workers were dead or dying. Neither side would retreat. Frick received reports by telegraph in his Pittsburgh office. He did not panic. He did not second guess. He sent a message to the Pinkertons: hold position. Reinforcements were coming. But the Pinkertons broke first. At 5 in the afternoon, after 12 hours under fire, the guards raised a white flag. They agreed to surrender if workers allowed them to leave safely. The workers agreed. The Pinkertons came ashore, and the moment they did, the crowd turned. Workers beat them with clubs, threw rocks, stripped them, forced them to run a gauntlet through town while men, women, and children struck them with whatever they could grab. Some guards were hospitalized, others fled into the countryside. The barges were set on fire and sank. Homestead belonged to the workers. Fort Frick had fallen. Newspapers across the country covered the battle. Illustrations showed workers firing cannons at barges. Headlines called it a massacre. Public opinion split. Labor supporters praised the workers' courage. Industrialists called it anarchy. And Frick faced a choice. He could retreat, acknowledge the union, negotiate a settlement, or he could escalate. He chose escalation. On July 10th, Frick sent a telegram to Pennsylvania Governor Robert Pattison. He requested 8,000 state militia troops to retake Homestead. He framed it as a matter of law and order. The plant was private property. The workers were trespassing. The state had a duty to enforce property rights. The governor agreed. On July 12th, 8,000 uniformed soldiers marched into Homestead. They occupied the plant, cleared the picketers, established martial law. Workers who resisted were arrested. Union leaders were charged with conspiracy, and Frick reopened the facility with replacement workers, protected by armed troops. The strike was broken, but the cost was not just tactical. It was reputational. Newspapers began calling Frick a tyrant. Labor organizers used Homestead as proof that industrialists valued property more than lives. Clergy preached sermons condemning the violence. Even some of Frick's business peers privately questioned whether the fight had been worth it. Frick did not care. He had won. Production resumed, costs dropped, the union was destroyed. From his perspective, sentiment was irrelevant. Results were all that mattered, but sentiment had consequences he did not anticipate. On July 22nd, 10 days after the militia arrived, a young man named Alexander Berkman read about Homestead in a New York anarchist newspaper. Berkman was 23 years old, a Russian immigrant, a believer in propaganda by deed. He saw Frick not as a manager enforcing contracts, but as a symbol of capitalist oppression. He decided that killing Frick could ignite a revolution. Berkman had no formal plan, no training, no resources. He borrowed money from his partner Emma Goldman, bought a revolver, boarded a train to Pittsburgh, walked into Frick's office building, told the receptionist he had business to discuss, and was shown upstairs. Frick was meeting with 2 associates when Berkman entered. He did not recognize the young man, did not sense danger. And before he could ask what Berkman wanted, Berkman pulled the revolver and fired. The first bullet hit Frick in the neck, the second hit his shoulder, the third missed. Frick lunged across the desk and grabbed Berkman's arm. They struggled. Frick's associates tackled Berkman. Someone screamed for help. Berkman pulled a sharpened steel file from his pocket and began stabbing. He stabbed Frick in the side, in the back, in the leg, 7 times in total. Each thrust was meant to kill. None did. Office workers flooded the room. They wrestled Berkman to the floor, pinned him, disarmed him. Frick stood up, blood soaking through his shirt, and gave an order. "Do not kill him. Call the police." Then he sat back down at his desk, pressed a handkerchief to his neck, and resumed his meeting. Blood pooled on the floor beneath his chair. His colleagues begged him to seek medical help. Frick refused. He had business to finish. An hour later, when the meeting concluded, Frick allowed a doctor to examine him. The bullets were still lodged in his body, 2 in the neck, 1 in the shoulder. The stab wounds had punctured muscle, but missed vital organs. The doctor recommended immediate surgery. Frick agreed, on one condition: do it here, in the office. He would not leave his desk. The surgery lasted 2 hours. Frick refused anesthesia. He remained conscious while the doctor extracted the bullets and stitched the wounds. When it was over, Frick returned to work. He dictated correspondence, reviewed production reports, signed contracts, as if nothing had happened. News of the assassination attempt spread faster than news of the strike. Papers called Frick superhuman. Editorials praised his courage. Even workers who despised him admitted a grudging respect. The man who had sent armed guards against strikers had also refused to break under gunfire and knives. The attempt to destroy Frick had made him a legend, but it had also revealed something he could not control. Public perception was not a ledger. It could not be calculated or managed with the same precision as coal seams or labor costs. He had survived the bullets, but surviving history would prove more difficult. Chapter 5: The Assassination That Made Him Legend. Alexander Berkman entered Frick's office, believing that killing one man could ignite a revolution, but he underestimated what Frick was willing to endure. The trial began 3 months later. Berkman faced charges of attempted murder. He represented himself in court, using the proceedings as a platform to denounce capitalism, private property, and the Homestead killings. He called Frick a murderer, described the strike as class warfare, argued that assassination was justified self-defense on behalf of the working class. The jury deliberated for 5 minutes, as guilty on all counts. Berkman was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Frick attended the trial once. He sat in the gallery, neck still bandaged, and listened to Berkman's speeches without expression. When reporters asked for comment, Frick declined. He had said all he intended to say by surviving. But the assassination attempt left scars beyond the physical. Adelaide had been at their Pittsburgh home when news arrived that her husband had been shot. She rushed to his office, found him sitting upright with doctors stitching wounds, and realized the same thing she had realized when their daughter died. Frick's emotional architecture did not allow for vulnerability. He could endure pain. He could not process fear. She stayed with him through the recovery, changed his bandages, monitored his sleep, watched for signs of infection or psychological collapse. Neither came. Within a week, Frick returned to full duties. Within 2 weeks, he had resumed 18-hour workdays. The assassination had interrupted nothing. For Adelaide, the interruption was permanent. She began withdrawing from public life. She spent more time at their estate in rural Pennsylvania. She wrote letters to friends describing feelings of dread and helplessness. She did not blame her husband for the attack, but she could not separate his survival from the choices that had invited violence. Frick noticed her withdrawal but did not address it. He believed that time would heal what conversation could not. He was wrong. The distance between them grew, not into hostility, into something colder. The recognition that they loved each other within limits, and those limits had been reached. Meanwhile, the strike collapsed. By November 1892, the union admitted defeat. Workers who had held out for 5 months returned on Frick's terms. No union recognition, individual contracts, lower wages than before the strike. The Amalgamated Association never recovered its influence. Within a decade, it ceased to exist. Frick had won completely, but the victory's cost became apparent in ways he had not predicted. His name became synonymous with labor violence. Political cartoons depicted him as a robber baron crushing workers beneath gold coins. Anarchist newspapers called for his death. Even moderate voices described him as a cautionary example of unchecked industrial power. Carnegie, watching from Scotland where he had conveniently vacationed during the strike, began distancing himself. He sent private letters to newspapers claiming he had opposed Frick's tactics, that he would have negotiated, that Homestead had been mishandled. It was a lie. Carnegie had approved every decision. But he understood what Frick did not. Public reputation could not be managed through force. The relationship between Carnegie and Frick, already strained by egos, began deteriorating. Carnegie resented that Frick's notoriety overshadowed his own philanthropic image. Frick resented that Carnegie played benefactor while leaving dirty work to subordinates. By 1897, the partnership was breaking. The proximate cause was financial. Carnegie attempted to dilute Frick's ownership stake in Carnegie Steel by issuing new shares at below market rates. Frick saw it as theft. He sued. Carnegie countersued. The dispute became public, ugly, personal. Depositions revealed years of resentment. Carnegie called Frick autocratic, ruthless, impossible to work with. Frick called Carnegie a coward who hid behind philanthropy while profiting from brutality. Both were right. The settlement came in 1900. Carnegie bought out Frick's shares for $18 million, roughly $500 million in modern currency. Frick walked away wealthier than he had ever imagined, but he also walked away professionally exiled. At 51 years old, he was no longer chairman of Carnegie Steel. no longer involved in the coke business he had built from nothing, no longer tied to the industrial empire that had defined his identity. He had money, but money was not purpose. The final confrontation happened in Carnegie's office. No lawyers, and no witnesses. Just two men who had built an empire together and could no longer stand to occupy the same room. Carnegie spoke first, accused Frick of disloyalty, of undermining morale, of prioritizing his own wealth over the company's future. Frick let him finish. Then he stood, looked Carnegie in the eye, and delivered a single sentence that ended their relationship forever. "I'll see you in hell." He walked out, never spoke to Carnegie again, and began the second act of his life. The one where he stopped building wealth and started building permanence. Chapter 6: The Partnership That Could Not Hold. Andrew Carnegie praised Frick publicly as the greatest manager in the world, but privately, he was already planning the betrayal. The breakdown had been years in the making. On the surface, the partnership worked. Carnegie provided vision and capital. Frick provided execution and control. Together, they had built the largest steel company in America, employing over 20,000 workers and generating annual revenues exceeding $40 million. But the surface hid fundamental differences. Carnegie believed in public benevolence. He wrote essays on the moral duties of the wealthy, donated libraries, funded universities, cultivated an image as a friend to progress. He needed the public to see him as more than a robber baron. His ego demanded it. Frick had no such need. He believed that wealth required no justification beyond its existence, that pretending moral superiority was hypocritical, that workers who resented him were free to find other employment. He did not seek approval, and that made him dangerous to Carnegie's reputation. Homestead had proven it. While Frick managed the strike, Carnegie vacationed in Scotland. He sent private messages of support. But when newspapers condemned the violence, Carnegie claimed ignorance, said he would have negotiated, that Frick had exceeded his authority. Frick knew it was a lie. He had correspondence proving Carnegie approved every decision, but he did not expose it. He understood that Carnegie's weakness was vanity, and vanity made men predictable. The financial dispute began in 1899. Carnegie Steel had grown so profitable that its partners were becoming independently wealthy. Frick's shares alone were worth over $50 million. Carnegie saw this as a problem. He believed that partners who became too rich lost motivation. They stopped working, stopped innovating, became complacent. So he proposed a solution. Issue new shares at book value, not market value, to dilute existing holdings. This would reduce everyone's percentage ownership while allowing Carnegie to maintain control. It would also reduce the payout if partners decided to sell. Frick saw it for what it was, theft disguised as restructuring. He refused to accept the new terms. Carnegie pushed harder. The board voted in Carnegie's favor. Frick sued. The lawsuit exposed years of financial maneuvering, personal grudges, and incompatible philosophies. Carnegie's lawyers argued that Frick was a disruptive influence, that his management style alienated workers and invited violence, that Homestead had cost the company millions in lost production and damaged reputation, that Frick prioritized his own enrichment over collective success. Frick's lawyers argued the opposite, that Carnegie had approved every labor decision, that profits had increased under Frick's management, that Carnegie was attempting to rewrite history to protect his philanthropic image, that the real issue was ego, not economics. The depositions were vicious. Carnegie called Frick a goddamned thief who manipulated numbers to inflate his own compensation. Frick called Carnegie a moral coward who built libraries with money extracted through violence he refused to acknowledge. Both men meant what they said, and both knew the partnership could not survive. The settlement came in January 1900. Carnegie bought Frick's shares for $18 million, payable over 5 years. Frick agreed to resign from all positions within Carnegie Steel. He would retain no influence, no authority, and no connection to the empire he had helped build. It was a clean break, but not a fair one. Frick believed the shares were worth more than $18 million. Market valuation suggested closer to $30 million. But he accepted the deal because continued litigation would cost more in time than he would gain in money. And at 51, time had become his most valuable asset. The night the settlement was finalized, Adelaide asked him what he would do next. Frick did not have an answer. For 30 years, his identity had been inseparable from industry. He had no hobbies, no social circle outside business, no interests beyond accumulation. But he had money, more than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. And Adelaide had been collecting paintings. She had started years earlier, buying small works by American artists, landscapes, portraits, nothing extraordinary. But she had studied them, visited galleries, learned to distinguish good craftsmanship from great art, and she had developed an obsession. Old masters, European painters from the 15th through 18th centuries, Vermeer, Rembrandt, Titian, Turner, artists whose work had survived centuries and would survive centuries more. Frick had tolerated her hobby. Now he saw its potential. Art could not be diluted like stock shares. It could not be devalued by boardroom votes. It existed independent of markets, of partnerships, of betrayals. A painting by Vermeer was worth what someone would pay for it, and what someone would pay increased with time. More importantly, art was permanent. Steel rusted, companies collapsed, fortunes were lost. But a Rembrandt painted in 1630 would still be a Rembrandt in 2030. For the first time since the assassination attempt, Frick felt interested in something beyond revenge. He had lost his partnership with Carnegie. He could not reclaim his reputation, but he could build something Carnegie never would, a legacy that required no apology. In 1901, Frick and Adelaide moved to New York City. They rented a mansion on Fifth Avenue while planning something larger, something permanent. Frick began visiting galleries, auction houses, private collections. He hired art advisors, studied provenance, learned which paintings were available and which were not, and he started buying. His first major acquisition was a Rembrandt portrait purchased for $100,000. The second was a Turner Seascape for $75,000. Within 2 years, he had spent over $1 million assembling a collection that rivaled anything in America. But he was not satisfied. Rival collections were private, hidden, accessible only to owners and their guests. Frick wanted something different. He wanted a collection that would outlast him, that would bear his name, that would force the public to acknowledge his taste even as they despised his fortune. He began planning a house, not a residence, a museum, a palace designed to display art and to survive. And in 1913, at age 63, he broke ground on 1 East 70th Street. Chapter 7, The House That Demanded Permanence. In 1913, at age 63, Frick began building the one thing no one could take from him. Not Carnegie, not workers, not history. The site was a full block on Fifth Avenue between 70th and 71st Streets. It overlooked Central Park. It occupied one of the most expensive parcels of land in America. Frick paid $2,475,000 for it, equivalent to $70 million today. He hired Thomas Hastings, the architect who had designed the New York Public Library. The instructions were specific: build a house that could become a museum. Design rooms around the paintings, not the paintings around the rooms. Use materials that would last 500 years. Hastings delivered plans for a structure unlike anything else on Fifth Avenue. 61 rooms, 27,000 square feet, exterior walls of Indiana limestone, 3 feet thick in places, interior walls reinforced with steel to support heavy frames, ceilings 18 feet high in the main galleries, skylights designed to filter northern light for optimal viewing, a central courtyard with a fountain, a music room, a library, a dining room that could seat 40, and a private bowling alley on the second floor, hidden from public view. Construction began in spring 1913. Frick managed the project the way he had managed steel production: daily reports, strict budgets, zero tolerance for delays. He visited the site weekly, inspected materials, questioned decisions, made changes when necessary. The house took 14 months to build. The final cost exceeded $5 million, not including furnishings or art. Modern equivalent approaches $150 million, but Frick was not building for cost efficiency. He was building for immortality. The scale revealed his ambition. The entrance hall featured marble columns imported from Italy. The walls were covered in silk damask. The floors were inlaid parquet. Every detail was selected to convey weight, permanence, taste. The West Gallery, designed to display his largest paintings, measured 70 feet long and 22 feet wide. The ceiling was coffered walnut. The walls were fabric covered to protect the art. Benches were placed at viewing distance. The Fragonard room housed 14 panels painted by Jean-Honoré Fragonard in 1771. Frick had purchased the entire series from the estate of J.P. Morgan. The panels depicted the progress of love, a romantic narrative told through allegorical scenes. Hastings designed the room specifically to fit them, matching the proportions to the paintings rather than adapting the paintings to the space. The enamel room displayed Frick's collection of Limoges enamels, small decorative objects from the 15th and 16th centuries. The library contained rare books, illuminated manuscripts, and furniture once owned by European royalty. Every room was a statement, not of wealth, though wealth was required, of permanence. Frick understood that money alone did not survive. John Jacob Astor had been the richest man in America. His fortune was divided among heirs and dissipated within 2 generations. Cornelius Vanderbilt had built railroads that reshaped the continent. His descendants sold them off and squandered the proceeds. Even Carnegie's libraries, funded by millions, were maintained by municipal budgets that could be cut. But art belonged to whoever possessed it, and if Frick possessed it inside a structure designed to outlast its builder, the art became his legacy. Adelaide oversaw the interior design. She selected fabrics, furniture, lighting. She worked with Hastings to ensure that each gallery had sightlines that drew the eye toward key works. She understood that the house was not just a container for art, it was theater, and Frick was the protagonist, even in absentia. The paintings themselves formed the core of his vision. By 1914, Frick owned works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Titian, El Greco, Goya, Turner, Constable, Gainsborough, and dozens of other masters. The collection was worth over $40 million, more than most museums possessed. His acquisition strategy was methodical. He targeted works with unimpeachable provenance: royal collections, estate sales, private holdings from European aristocrats liquidating assets. He avoided contemporary art entirely. Modernism did not interest him. He wanted paintings that had already survived centuries and proven their value. His most prized acquisition came in 1911, 3 years before the house was completed. Johannes Vermeer's Mistress and Maid, painted around 1667. Frick paid $130,000 for it, the highest price ever paid for a Vermeer at that time. $130,000. The average American factory worker earned $500 per year. Frick's single painting cost the equivalent of 260 years of labor. He hung it in the South Hall, positioned so visitors entering the house would see it immediately. The painting depicted a domestic scene, a maid delivering a letter to her mistress. The mistress's expression was ambiguous: concern, fear, anticipation. Vermeer left it unresolved. Frick loved the ambiguity. He believed that great art resisted easy interpretation, that beauty was not simple, that permanence required complexity. The house was completed in December 1914. Frick and Adelaide moved in immediately. They brought 27 live-in servants: cooks, maids, butlers, chauffeurs. The household operated like a small hotel with strict schedules and defined roles. But Frick spent little time enjoying it. He was 65 years old. His health was declining. He had survived assassination, but time was undefeated. And he knew that the house's true purpose would only be realized after his death. So he began planning the gift he could not give while alive. On Chapter 8, The Art That Could Not Apologize. Frick spent $40 million assembling paintings he believed would outlive everything, including the men who painted them and the men who hated him. The collection was not random. It was not accumulation for status. Every painting served a thesis Frick had developed over 2 decades of study. That beauty was objective, that certain works transcended their moment and spoke across centuries, that permanence was achievable if you knew what to preserve. He rejected contemporary art entirely. No impressionists, no modernists, no experimental movements. When advisors suggested he acquire works by Monet or Cézanne, artists whose prices were climbing, Frick refused. He called them fashionable, and fashion, by definition, faded. He wanted masters, painters whose reputations had survived the test of time. Vermeer, dead for 200 years. Rembrandt, dead for 250. Titian, dead for 300. If their work still commanded reverence centuries after their deaths, it would likely command reverence centuries hence. This was not sentiment. It was calculation applied to aesthetics. By 1915, Frick owned 3 Vermeers. Only 36 Vermeers existed in the entire world. Owning 3 meant controlling nearly 10% of the artist's surviving output. The scarcity increased value. The value increased permanence. His Rembrandt collection was even more extensive: 7 paintings and over a dozen etchings. The Polish Rider, painted around 1655, depicted a young man on horseback, armed and alert. Art historians debated its meaning. Was it a portrait, an allegory, a historical scene? The uncertainty fascinated Frick. He believed that art, which resisted complete understanding, demanded repeated viewing, and repeated viewing built legacy. He also collected landscapes: J.M.W. Turner's seascapes, John Constable's countryside views. These were not fashion. They were technique elevated to vision. Turner painted storms that looked like they could sink ships. Constable painted clouds that moved across canvas. The skill was undeniable, and undeniable skill survived criticism. Frick's taste was not universally admired. Some critics called his collection conservative. They said he avoided risk, that he bought reputation rather than discovery, that true collectors championed emerging artists, not dead certainties. Frick ignored them. He was not collecting to impress critics. He was collecting to outlast them. Adelaide played a larger role than public records acknowledged. She attended auctions, corresponded with dealers, studied catalogs. When a painting came available, she often made the first assessment. If she approved, Frick considered it. If she hesitated, he passed. Their partnership extended beyond aesthetics. Adelaide understood that the collection was Frick's response to Homestead. Not apology, response. He could not change what he had done, but he could create something beautiful enough to complicate the narrative. People who visited the mansion saw this tension. They walked through galleries hung with masterworks and knew those masterworks were purchased with profits from coke and steel, from 12-hour shifts in 100-degree heat, from wages so low that workers' children went hungry, from a system Frick had perfected and defended. The art did not erase that, but it coexisted with it. And that coexistence was the point. Frick believed that history simplified, that future generations would reduce him to a caricature, robber baron, strikebreaker, tyrant. The art complicated that reduction. It forced acknowledgement that the same man who sent armed guards against workers also assembled one of the finest collections of European painting in America. Was it hypocrisy? Or was it proof that humans contained multitudes, even monstrous ones? Frick never answered the question publicly, but his private correspondence suggested he thought about it constantly. In a letter to a friend in 1916, he wrote, "I have built what I could with what I had. If the world judges me harshly, it will still visit my galleries." The statement was not defensive. It was predictive. He knew he would be judged, knew the judgment would be harsh, and knew that judgment would not prevent people from wanting to see his Vermeers. The mansion itself amplified this contradiction. It was beautiful, undeniably, almost oppressively beautiful. Marble, silk, gilt, light, every surface designed to convey refinement. And yet, the beauty was built on Homestead's foundation. Could you admire the one without excusing the other? Frick did not care. He believed that beauty existed independent of its creator's morality. That Vermeer's genius was not diminished by who owned the painting. That Turner's storms were sublime regardless of who hung them. This belief allowed him to avoid guilt. He had not wronged anyone by buying art. The violence was separate. The beauty was separate. They shared a timeline, but not a moral equivalence. Adelaide was less certain. In her private journals, she wrote about the weight of living in such splendor while knowing its source. She did not condemn her husband, but she also did not celebrate him. She occupied the same space the house did, complicit but not convinced. Their marriage, by this point, had become formal. They lived together, entertained together, appeared together in public. But intimacy had died with their daughter Martha. What remained was partnership, mutual respect, and shared recognition that they had both chosen this path and could not unchosen it. Frick continued acquiring art until the year before his death. His final major purchase was Gainsborough's The Mall in St. James's Park, bought in 1918 for $77,000. The painting depicted fashionable Londoners strolling through a park at dusk. It was elegant, composed, utterly devoid of conflict. Frick hung it in the dining room. He liked looking at it during meals. He said it reminded him that beauty required no justification beyond its existence. Whether he believed that about the painting or about himself was never clear. Chapter 9. The gift he could not give in life. Frick signed his will in 1919, 3 months before his death, and made one demand. The mansion must become a museum immediately. He had been planning the bequest for years. The structure was already designed for public access. The galleries were laid out for viewing. The collection was catalogued. All that remained was legal mechanism. The will specified that 1 East 70th Street would become the Frick Collection, a public museum open to anyone who wished to visit. Adelaide could continue living there until her death, but after she passed, the house would transition fully into institutional ownership. He endowed the museum with $15 million, equivalent to over $200 million today, to cover maintenance, acquisitions, and operations in perpetuity. It was the largest cultural bequest America had ever received. Larger than anything Carnegie had donated. It larger than the Mellon or Rockefeller foundations would give for decades. And it came with one unbreakable condition. The collection could never be sold, loaned, or dispersed. It must remain intact in that building forever. Frick understood that museums routinely sold works to fund operations, that collections were broken up, loaned to other institutions, scattered. He refused to allow it. The permanence he sought required physical continuity. The paintings in that house, under his name, unchanged. The will also specified that no portrait of Frick could ever hang in the galleries. He wanted the art to speak for itself, not be overshadowed by the man who bought it. This was not modesty, it was control. Even in death, Frick dictated terms. He died on December 2nd, 1919. Heart failure. He was 70 years old. Adelaide was with him. So were his surviving children, Helen and Childs. The death was not dramatic. He simply stopped. One moment breathing, the next gone. News of his death made front pages across the country. The New York Times obituary was 1,700 words. It described his business career, his art collection, his philanthropy, and it included a sentence that captured his legacy more honestly than any eulogy. His name is abhorrent to organized labor. Labor newspapers went further. They called him a murderer, said Homestead's dead workers haunted his fortune, that no amount of art could wash blood from money, that accepting his bequest meant accepting guilt by association. The controversy was immediate. New York's Board of Estimate had to approve the museum's tax-exempt status. Union representatives lobbied against it, and they argued that public money should not support an institution built on exploitation, that Frick's wealth was stolen from workers and should be returned to them, not displayed in galleries. The board approved the museum anyway. The art was too valuable, the bequest too generous. And despite the protests, most New Yorkers wanted access to Vermeer and Rembrandt, regardless of who had bought them. But Adelaide complicated the transition. The will allowed her to live in the mansion until her death. She was 61, in good health. She could live another 20 years, and during that time, the museum could not open. Some speculated she delayed deliberately, that she resented being turned into a temporary resident of what had been her home. Others believed she simply wanted privacy during grief. Whatever the reason, she stayed, and the mansion remained closed to the public for 16 years. During that time, the art world changed. Modernism dominated. museums acquired Picasso, Matisse, abstract expressionists. The old masters Frick had collected seemed increasingly conservative. Critics questioned whether his taste had been visionary or merely safe. Adelaide did not defend him. She rarely gave interviews. She maintained the collection exactly as Frick had left it, added nothing, removed nothing, lived among paintings worth tens of millions while the world outside debated whether they mattered. Her isolation mirrored the mansion's. Both were suspended between private grief and public obligation. Both waited for death to release them. Adelaide died in 1931, 12 years after Frick. The mansion could now transition. But first, it required modification. Frick's private quarters had to be converted into galleries. The bowling alley had to be repurposed. The servants' areas had to be reimagined for administrative use. The architect John Russell Pope oversaw the work. He preserved Frick's original vision while making the space functional as a museum. He added a music room, expanded gallery walls, installed climate control systems to protect the paintings. The modifications took 4 years. The museum finally opened on December 16, 1935, 16 years after Frick's death, 21 years after the mansion's completion. And when it opened, protesters lined the sidewalk. They carried signs. Built on broken backs. Homestead remembers. Blood Money Museum. Inside, 250 invited guests toured the galleries. They saw the Vermeers, the Rembrandts, the Turners. They marveled at the collection's quality. They praised Frick's vision, and they ignored the protesters. The New York Tribune ran an editorial the next day. It acknowledged the art's beauty. It also refused to forget the source. The closing sentence read, "His money was stained with the blood of Homestead. His paintings are stained with nothing but genius. The two facts will coexist forever." Frick would have appreciated the honesty. He had never pretended otherwise. Chapter 10. The Museum That Opened, Despite Itself. When the Frick collection opened to the public in 1935, protesters stood outside carrying signs that read, "Built on broken backs." The protests lasted 3 weeks. Union members from across New York rotated shifts on the sidewalk. They handed out pamphlets detailing Homestead's history. They reminded passers-by that Frick had hired armed guards against striking workers, that men had died, that no amount of art justified violence. The museum's board ignored them. Visitors ignored them. The press covered them briefly, then moved on. Within a month, the protests stopped, not because sentiment changed, because attention did. The Frick collection became what Frick had designed it to be, a public institution housing private taste, free admission on Tuesdays, membership available for those who wanted unlimited access, guided tours on weekends, everything a museum should offer, and people came, thousands in the first year, tens of thousands within 5 years. They came to see Vermeer, to study Rembrandt, to experience European masterworks without traveling to Europe. The collection's quality justified the visit, and few visitors spent time thinking about how Frick had paid for it. This was the museum's fundamental tension. It existed because of Frick, but it transcended him. The paintings were centuries old when he bought them. They would be centuries old when everyone who remembered Homestead was dead. The art outlasted its patron. The building itself aged gracefully. The limestone exterior weathered but did not crumble. The interior materials proved as durable as Hastings had promised. Silk could be replaced. Wood could be refinished. but the structure's bones were permanent. By 1950, the neighborhood around the museum had transformed. Fifth Avenue's other Gilded Age mansions were being demolished. The Vanderbilt Chateau was torn down and replaced with an apartment building. The Astor Mansion became a commercial tower. One by one, the palaces fell. The Frick collection survived, partially because of zoning. Frick's will had established the museum as a cultural institution with special legal protections. The building could not be demolished without court approval, and courts were reluctant to destroy institutions serving the public good. But survival required more than legal structure. It required endowment. The $15 million Frick had left proved sufficient to maintain operations through economic downturns, wars, and changing tastes. The museum never had to sell paintings to pay bills, never had to compromise Frick's vision to stay solvent. This financial independence made the Frick collection unique. Most museums relied on annual fundraising. They courted donors, sold naming rights, made compromises. The Frick collection did none of that. It existed on Frick's terms because Frick had funded it to resist outside pressure. The irony was obvious. The man who had crushed unions to maintain total control had built an institution that maintained total control after his death. The mechanism was different. The principle was identical. Visitors rarely thought about this. They walked through the galleries, admired the paintings, appreciated the preservation. They experienced the collection as Frick intended, as beauty requiring no context beyond itself. But some visitors could not separate the art from its history. They read the wall text identifying Frick as the founder. They researched his life. They discovered Homestead. And they had to reconcile admiration for the collection with revulsion for the collector. And the museum never tried to resolve that tension. It did not hide Frick's history, but it did not foreground it either. The focus was always the art. Frick was presented as patron, not as person. His biography was available for those who sought it, but it was not forced on anyone. This approach allowed the museum to serve multiple audiences: art lovers who cared only about Vermeer, history students who wanted to understand Gilded Age wealth, activists who saw the collection as evidence of systemic exploitation. All could visit, all could interpret. The museum accommodated them all without endorsing any single narrative. Over decades, the Frick collection became a New York institution. It appeared in guidebooks. Professors brought students. Tourists made it a required stop. The building's intimacy distinguished it from larger museums, and you could see the entire collection in 2 hours. You could return weekly and notice new details. And through it all, the protesters' question remained unanswered. Can a building outlive its builder's sins? The Frick collection existed as ongoing experiment. The answer was not yes or no. It was both. Chapter 11. The mansion that survived everything else. Every other Gilded Age palace on Fifth Avenue was demolished. The Vanderbilt Chateau, the Astor Mansion, the Morgan residence. But Frick's remained. The difference was design, not aesthetic design, legal design. When Frick wrote his will, he understood that buildings were demolished for 2 reasons: economic pressure or legal vulnerability. He eliminated both. The endowment removed economic pressure. $15 million in 1919, invested conservatively, generated enough income to maintain the building indefinitely. The museum never needed to sell the property, never needed to accept offers from developers, never faced a scenario where demolition was financially necessary. The legal structure removed vulnerability. Frick had established the museum as a charitable trust with specific restrictions. The collection could not be sold. The building could not be repurposed. Any attempt to dissolve the trust required proving that its charitable purpose had become impossible to fulfill. That standard was nearly impossible to meet. As long as people wanted to see Vermeer and Rembrandt, the museum served a public purpose. As long as it served a public purpose, the trust remained valid. As long as the trust remained valid, the building was protected. Frick had not invented this structure, and charitable trusts had existed for centuries, but he had applied them with unusual precision. Most donors left flexibility, allowed trustees to adapt if circumstances changed. Frick allowed nothing. His will was ironclad. His vision was permanent. The result was architectural immortality. By 2010, the Frick Collection was the only intact Gilded Age mansion remaining on Fifth Avenue. Everything else had been replaced by apartments, office towers, hotels. The real estate was too valuable. The buildings were too expensive to maintain. Economics won, except at 1 East 70th Street. There, economics lost, because Frick had designed the institution to be economically self-sufficient and legally untouchable. The collection itself appreciated beyond Frick's projections. The $40 million he spent on art in the early 1900s was worth over $5 billion by 2020. Vermeer alone accounted for hundreds of millions. Scarcity had driven value higher than anyone predicted. The museum's board could have sold a single painting and funded operations for decades. They could have loaned works to other institutions for fees. They could have monetized the collection in countless ways. But Frick's will prohibited all of it. The painting stayed, in that building, under that name, unchanged. By the 21st century, the Frick Collection attracted over 400,000 visitors annually. Some came for the art, some came for the architecture, some came because they had heard the story and wanted to see the contradiction for themselves. Because the contradiction was the draw. A palace built by a man labor despised, filled with beauty, funded by brutality. Open to a public that would never have been allowed through the doors during Frick's lifetime. It was everything wrong with Gilded Age excess and everything right about public access to culture. The museum added modern amenities over decades: climate control, security systems, digital catalogs, but the core remained untouched. You could stand in the West Gallery in 2020 and see essentially what Frick saw in 1914. Same paintings, same walls, same light. That continuity was unique. Most museums reinvented themselves every generation. New wings, new missions, new audiences. The Frick Collection resisted reinvention. It was what it had always been: a rich man's house, preserved as a museum, and sustained by a fortune that would never run out. Critics occasionally questioned the model. They argued that the museum was too small, too exclusive, too tied to one man's taste, that it should sell works to fund acquisitions of diverse artists, that it should expand, modernize, democratize. The museum's response was always the same. Frick's will prohibited those changes. The institution existed to preserve his vision, not to evolve beyond it. This rigidity was both strength and limitation. The Frick Collection would never be the Metropolitan Museum or the Guggenheim. It would never house contemporary art or experimental installations. It would remain exactly what Frick built: a monument to old masters and the man who collected them. And that was enough. Because in a city that demolished everything old to build something new, the Frick Collection proved that permanence was possible, not through adaptation, through refusal, Frick had refused to negotiate with unions, refused to soften his reputation, refused to apologize, and in death, his museum refused to change. The consistency was almost admirable, almost horrifying, always both. Chapter 12. The Question That Will Not Close. You can walk through the Frick collection today and see Vermeer's Light, Rembrandt's Shadows, Turner's Storms. All bought with money Frick earned breaking men. The question is unavoidable. Should you accept the gift? Museums across America grapple with similar questions. Confederate monuments, Sackler galleries funded by opioid profits, donor names on buildings funded by exploitation. The Frick collection is not unique in forcing moral compromise, but it forces it with unusual clarity, because Frick never apologized, never softened, never pretended his fortune was clean. He built the museum knowing exactly what it represented: beauty inseparable from violence, legacy inseparable from sin. He believed that history would judge him harshly and accept his paintings anyway. He was right. 400,000 people visit annually. They see the art. They read the plaques. They walk through rooms designed to house masterworks and ignore the man who assembled them. Or they try to ignore him. Frick's presence lingers in the building's architecture, in the collection's coherence, in the will that binds it all together. You cannot experience the Frick collection without experiencing Frick. Even if you wanted to focus only on Vermeer, the museum exists because Frick bought Vermeer. The two are inseparable. So what does acceptance mean? Does visiting the museum excuse Homestead? Does admiring the art condone the system that funded it? Or can you hold both truths simultaneously? That the collection serves the public good and the collector caused public harm? The museum does not answer. It presents the contradiction and leaves resolution to the visitor. Some people refuse to visit. They see the Frick collection as a monument to injustice. Blood money laundered through culture. They argue that accepting the gift legitimizes the violence that created it. That society should reject institutions built on exploitation, regardless of their beauty. Others argue the opposite. That the art belongs to humanity, not to Frick. That Vermeer painted those scenes for reasons unrelated to who eventually bought them. That denying public access to masterworks punishes the present for the past sins. Both positions are defensible. Neither resolves the tension. Frick understood this. In his final years, he wrote letters suggesting he knew the museum would be controversial. He did not care. He believed that beauty outlasted morality. That centuries from now, people would still visit the Frick collection because the paintings were extraordinary. And the extraordinary transcended its origin. Whether he was right depends on what you believe permanence means. If permanence is just survival, Frick succeeded. The mansion stands. The collection endures. His name persists. But if permanence requires redemption, he failed. Time has not forgiven Homestead. History has not softened. The judgment remains harsh. And yet, the museum thrives. Not despite the contradiction, because of it. The Frick collection forces visitors to confront questions most museums allow them to avoid. Where does wealth come from? What does it cost? Can institutions built on exploitation serve justice? Should they? There are no clean answers, just the paintings, just the building, just the endowment that keeps both intact. Frick spent his final decade assembling beauty he believed would outlive everything. He was partially right. The beauty outlived him. But it did not outlive the question. Cannot outlive the question. Because the question is the legacy. Every visitor walks through those galleries carrying the same choice Frick made. Accept the beauty, accept the source, or refuse both. The mansion survives because Frick made survival inevitable. The question survives because he made the question inevitable. And standing in the West Gallery, looking at Vermeer's light filtering through a painted window, you realize that acceptance and refusal are not opposites. They are the same act, the same compromise, the same recognition that beauty and brutality can share the same foundation and the same future. Frick knew this. Adelaide knew this. Every visitor knows this. And the knowledge changes nothing. The paintings remain. The mansion remains. The contradiction remains. That is the gift Frick left. Not resolution. Permanence without redemption. Beauty without forgiveness. A palace that forces America to accept genius from hands it despises. And we do, again and again, 400,000 times a year. The doors stay open, the question stays open, and neither will close.